Welcome to Talent Talks, the podcast where your host, Dan Maisey, dives into hiring's ins and outs. Our goal is to reveal how to attract top talent. Through interviews with leaders in sports, media and entertainment, we explore job search and recruitment trends, offer interview tips and strategies to differentiate yourself and uncover their hiring insights. Whether you're prepping for an interview or interested in hiring trends, Talent Talks is your essential resource. Let's dive in. Don Barrell, the CEO of Greenhouse Sports, brings a unique combination of experiences to our podcast today, from a distinguished career in rugby, playing for Saracens and England Sevens, to impactful roles in sports development and education. Don's journey is testament to his dedication to development and improvement. His work has spanned various aspects of sport, both performance and business, including leading England Rugby's male and female pathways and contributing to business strategy and change. With a BSc in anthropology and an MSc in coaching science, Don's expertise extends beyond the field, delving into his nuances of human development and the strategies behind successful teams. His leadership at Greenhouse Sports, aiming to give every child a fair chance to succeed, highlights his commitment to leveraging sports as a catalyst for positive change. This promises to be a fascinating conversation with Don's experience. So, Don, welcome to Talent Talks.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. How are you?
Yeah, we're good. We're on week 4 of this new role at this point. Maybe a bit longer when this publishes, but great. So very much enjoying a change at this point. So as you very kindly articulated at the start, on a bit of a pivot, sports connecting it, but very much on a new journey.
Well, we look forward to getting into it, but let's get started with the same question that we ask every single guest. What are your experiences of hiring and being hired, and do you have any lessons learned?
A really good question, and maybe start with experiences of being hired, because I think that's typically where we all start. My very first job was I was a tea boy. Used to serve tea for £20 a week. There you go, tea and cakes. So, and that was quite easy because that was someone who used to do a bit of tutoring for me, needed some extra help. So I don't think that process was overly robust, but it got me started.
No interview panel on that one then?
No interview panel.
Oh, right.
And I used to cut lawns with my mum, who was a gardener. So I didn't have an interview for that either. It was an interesting one, really. So I was fortunate to have had a career as a sportsman, so I got to play. My first proper interview when I was hired was, and still highlighted when I see the person who did it, he would describe as one of the worst he's been in. And I don't know what happened, having had a career where I felt comfortable running around and playing in front of crowds. I obviously melted in this thing and muttered my words, stumbled over answers. And I think what they were told about someone who was, relatively confident and would be happy was not met in the room. So it was a bit of a steep learning curve, actually. So there's not many people who have a first proper interview late in their 20s, having gone all the way. So it highlighted that whilst I thought I was good at a few things, it was a kind of brand new experience that I hadn't done enough of. So I think it taught me a lot. My experience of interviews since has been much more positive, to a stage now where actually the most recent one I had for this job, deeply enjoyable, had several rounds of speaking to various trustees, recruiters, and actually to the stage where it was great. It felt like a two-way conversation, and very much a chance to discuss, debate, reflect, and be incredibly honest, because at this point they were recruiting for, I guess, what they felt was fit. So it's important. It was a very authentic representation. So in that sense, that's been a journey. My experience of recruiting, again, I'm sure we'll go into in more detail, but I enjoyed the recruitment process and have a few things I think are critically important when we do it. So we can get into those a bit. But as an overall process on both sides, I now enjoy it.
Good. And you're right. We'll get into the enjoyment and the critical side of things. But going back to when you were being hired, you've stepped out of your comfort zone, and you say you kind of melted in that instance, but ultimately the reason being is because it was completely different to what you've done before, and that is massively stepping out of your comfort zone. How do you help people that you're interviewing feel at ease in that situation, and whether that is somebody that is coming in from university for a first job, or whether that is somebody like yourself who is ex-professional and actually getting their first interview at 29, 30, 35, whatever it is, proper interview, let's say. What techniques do you use to just kind of help put them at ease a little bit, or at least have you used in the past?
Yeah, on a very personal level, that it was a good experience, and it frustrated me from the fact I never would have been that unprepared for anything else that I'd done before that. And I go back and think, well, was that assumption? Like, to an extent, I think it was lack of prep, and the way the thing was pitched was come and have a conversation.
Okay.
It felt much more formal than the framing. So to your question, how would I help? I think really clearly framing what is the thing you're about to walk into. So is it an interview? Is it a conversation? Because I think a hijacked conversation that suddenly feels formal is not fair then on the person you're trying to bring in. So I think really, really clearly thinking what it is you want if you are interviewing someone, and then how you frame it. To an extent, how would you want them to feel? I think if you're going to do this well, then you need to make sure you give the person the best opportunity to show themselves. So that means you have to have considered your environment, the way you make an introduction to someone, the way you greet people at the door. Like that whole journey from first email and contact through to leaving whatever place we're in needs to be considered and planned. So I think you're doing that not to kind of pat yourselves on the back and say we're good at this. You're doing this to make the person into as normal a state as you can get them, so they give themselves the best shot. Because ultimately, you want the best person. So making someone trip over, and I think sometimes thinking that's a good thing because that's a test of pressure. I think if it's part of a multiple stage process, then maybe not. If it's like your only shot, then I think you're to an extent wasting some of your own time by not giving that person every opportunity to move.
Yeah, I've been in similar situations where I've been blindsided in that instance, and also been in similar situations where a pressured interview. I remember one time it was one of the first interviews out of uni, and I ended up getting the job, but I didn't end up taking it. And this relates back to your point earlier, which I'll make the link in a sec. But they said when they offered me the job that I was the only person that didn't cry in the final interview because of the amount of pressure they put on people. And I just thought to myself, I've got no interest in working there whatsoever. Like, why is that a good thing? And I think where you said around making people at ease from the moment that they get the email about the interview or the chat or whatever it is through the process, organizations, this is a theme that's come up as well, is organizations need to understand that they have to sell themselves as much as they're trying to get people into the business, because that person might not be the right fit for this role, but they might be the right fit for a role 2 or 3 times down the line. And if you haven't given them a good opportunity to experience how good your organization is, then they're not going to be interested in coming back to work for you, regardless of their fit for that role. So it's a really interesting kind of a point to raise, really. You mentioned it again. I said we'd come back to it, but you have critical elements that you look for when you're hiring. Let's get into those. What do you look for, and what's the really key elements that you need in your recruitment process?
Yeah, I look, it's a broad question, so feel free to kind of ask me to specify parts of it, just to an extent, given the size and scope of some of the places we would recruit. I think importantly, understanding the environment or culture you're in. So yes, I will have some values, right? So very personally, I'll have some values. To an extent, depending on someone's proximity to me, that may or may not be important if I'm not working daily with that person. And then there's it's more for the hiring manager and the initial team to work out, do they think that fits their little chunk? But overall, there's always a superstructure. There's a kind of enveloping wrap around any organization. And you need to be clear on what your organizational strands are that are really strong and important for you. And you have to find ways to work out if someone fits and they match and actually is their intent for that role right. And I think that's one. So that's something, and I appreciate that's quite broad, but I've worked in different places and they have different cultures to an extent where different things might be more or less important. So I think that's one. At the moment, so we said at the start, sport's been the theme, but the environment's different. So have been in performance sport for a long time before this, where we're moving people through to previously hopefully win World Cups, right? That was the intent. Now I'm absolutely the other end and absolutely loving it, genuinely loving the role. But at the other end, we just want to make sure that sport is a tool where young people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get behind the paywall that typically exists have a chance to be coached, to be mentored, and have that kind of that transformative experience that we can bring. So what's important in those two things, you can see different skills and traits in individuals that would suit those environments differently. So whilst they might be world class in their own arena, they may not fit as well in one another. So I think it's being really clear on that. To an extent, I also genuinely believe in broad diversity. So some of the best people I've brought into when I was working with England, we've brought people in who were non-rugby. I think that's important. So I think everyone likes to talk and says diversity is important, and then you push people, and the easiest thing to do is to go with someone and bring the skill set that already exists. So whatever domain you're in. So, okay, well, we liked the idea, but this person has 5 years of experience. And I think it's that but that needs challenging. That's the point that you have to stop. So if we say diversity, it's not, it's not just to say, I want to go and bring in someone because they're from a different field, or they have a different culture or different experiences. It's everything, and it's being challenging of one another on that. It's generational, it's age. So do you want everyone in a team who are the same age? Do you want everyone in a team who are the same gender? Do you want everyone in a team who are the same culture, religion? No, we want a mix. So you want a real, because ultimately the point of diversity done brilliantly and actively, it's a real superpower for an organisation. Like it transforms how you debate, how you really start to pin down ideas and how you uncover things. And I think that's one. And being brave enough that if you go out for a role and you don't think the group of people who've put in for it is right, then not just filling it because you had a time scale, taking a breath, working out if you could be better in the way you've advertised it or the way you've explained it or tried to sell the role, and then going again to say, okay, well, we didn't quite bring in the range of people we'd want. Let's go again. Let's not just be quick. So those would be pillars I think would be really important to me.
Yeah, and look, like I said at the outset, that there are a lot of themes that are coming up over this series of podcasts, and you've hit on a lot of those for a lot of organisations. But obviously, again, it comes back to your point again around how much practically are people doing versus what they want to be doing. I want to you go back to the values piece. You mentioned around your personal values versus the organization's personal values, and you're might not be hiring for someone that's going to sit next to you, and how that fits. When you are looking at the value side of things, how important is it that they fit the wider organizational values versus, right, what are the team values and the people that are in the team and their values, and how is that different, or is it different at all?
So yes, are they different? Yes, they can be. Now, look, scale of organisation. Like if I was a company of 10 versus a company of 1,000, then clearly there's difference. Everyone has to be within the playground of, like, we support and value what this company and organisation is trying to do. Like you need to want to go and play in that park to an extent. Bad analogy, but I'll carry on because I've started. Like if your team wants to be really good over on the swings, that's the thing they need to be good at. It's still in the park, so they need to go and recruit in that space. My big however, like I just answered the last one, a deliberate choice sometimes to bring in someone. Like if you have a stable centre and you can bring in someone who has elements of difference, or and making sure I'm clearly saying it, like a positive disruption. So just to check the cadence a bit, and just to bring in some questions. Like if 10% of the questions they landed were thought-provoking enough to just disrupt a bit, then I think that's a really positive thing. And again, that one we should be actively looking for. So I think that's part of the evolution of teams. So I think that's the one sometimes when you've got a view across a broader sect. Typically, if you're listening to people talk around hiring someone for their team, they want the person they quite often felt they gelled best with. And I think sometimes having that debate, so not letting that be the first answer. So just like, was it because we thought we'd all have a really nice time and went for a coffee, or was it because we thought they would bring something that we don't have? And then I think working with the people who are currently working for you on, well, how do I value difference like that? That's a cultural importance for me. So how can I get people to see and value difference? So you said at the start, like that was my kind of uni upbringing. I did anthropology, its principle is cultural relativism. So in effect, judging things within their own cultural boundaries and thoughts, not taking yours and plopping them in. So I think that's really important in this sense of, just letting your teams kind of hold your tension. So yes, that's important to them. Can we bring in someone who just slightly looks and changes them? And look, ultimately, making sure everyone's empowered to make their decisions. But I think that's the job of leading something, is to make sure everyone gets into the I guess when you see routine and you fall into a routine, you should find someone who can challenge it a bit. That's what you need. So get good at recognizing routines, and then just get someone to wobble you a touch.
Yeah, it's I think I completely agree. I think having somebody then that isn't a yes person, isn't going to just be I agree or follow everything, I think is critically important, because ultimately, yes, from a values perspective, you want people to have the same values in the way that helps the organization, helps the team drive forward. But at the same time, you're not hiring for a friend, you're hiring for a colleague, and you're hiring for somebody that ultimately is going to make the organization excel or the team excel. And that can be very different people. I think it's a very fine line between having somebody that you probably wouldn't get on with outside of work, but you have to work with them. So how does that impact on the working relationship and the team dynamics, versus having someone that you'd get on with, but is that going to help the team actually achieve their goals? And I think there is a balance, because ultimately you bring in, let's be completely honest, this is the whole no dickhead rule. You bring one in because they're a superstar salesperson, as an example, but the detrimental impact that they're going to have on the team longer term is going to be worse than not bringing them in from a short term win and sales perspective.
Yeah, I think that is, if you're fortunate enough to lead, that's the piece you have to tread finally. And I think that goes back to your stable core. I guess that goes back into how you want to or are prepared to manage things, and the level of, I guess, debate or disruption you're comfortable with happening. And I think ultimately, being sharp and clear on the point at which you feel, disruption becomes disruptive, and at that point, when it becomes normal, we're looking at issues when it becomes either something you can skillfully manage, and it becomes part of a meeting, and it's a clear kind of space for challenge, and you're comfortable, people leave a line fine. So I think, the balance of those two. But that comes back to your overriding point. How do you find that through a recruitment process? That requires real thought on what we're going to do and why. Like, so what are the things I need? So what do I need? Back to this, like, principle I like, which is definitely, one taken from sport, is this end in mind principle. So what is the end stage? What are we all trying to do? What does it look like when it's done? And then working backwards. So if you're clear on that, you can then look at what are the skills I need to deliver that. Where do I have gaps in that team? Who leads on certain things? Who doesn't? And if you have all that in place, I think that helps you get clear in terms of what you're recruiting in. I also think then the proximity to the stuff you're trying to succeed at. So if I needed to win on Friday, I'll make a different decision than if the really important Friday is in 10 years. Then that changes how we'll make that decision on the person and the group. So I think, have it just like checking that people have thought through those pieces, and they haven't always. So they walk into a decision. I hired person X because their CV said they've done it for 15 years and experience is good. Well, back to our point on diversity, and ultimately look at Greenhouse, where I'm working now. We are working with thousands of young people across the country who are absolutely as capable, and in many cases probably more so, than some of the people who are going to end up in the industry. Now they just don't have the shot to get in. So my job is making sure that we're going to provide it. So what's the skill set? Like, there's a universal skill set outside of very specific competence for a kind of role. So if the role is in sales, well, let's talk about the character. Let's talk about, the actual behaviors. Let's talk to me about the behaviors. I always see job descriptions based on technical competencies, not on behaviors. And really the thing that irritates people, makes people get kind of stepped out or exit roles, is behaviors. So And to an extent, that's back to that point. If I've got 10 years to make someone brilliant, then we'll start a behaviour. And back to my point, well, where I work now, I'll give you a great example. So these kids who are staying in it and staying part of our programs, I can guarantee they'll have done a load of things in their lives that are going to make them incredibly robust and resilient and hardworking, because they just have to. It's their default. But we need to be really good at making sure they can take the step in, and we can just get them onto the first platform. And that too often happens. It's the easy path of, I'm going to tick yes because there's technical competence, not because I've been brilliant in understanding behaviours. And I guess you'd be interested in your view on this. Like, how many times have you heard someone derail because the technical piece versus the behavioural, work ethic, fit, cultural piece? Like,
yeah, it's a really interesting, and again, the theme that is coming out of of talent talks a lot at the moment is, and rightly so, in my opinion, the technical skills side of things. Yes, there has to be a base level. There has to be prerequisites to certainly more senior levels and more senior roles. But ultimately, the parts of that can be learned. Your behavioural side of things is much more difficult to change and much more difficult to learn. There are opportunities to change that, and are opportunities to look at how you develop as a person and kind of on the longer term. But it does come back to your point that if I need somebody that is going to get me in X amount of revenue over the next 6 months, then I need somebody that has high level of technical skill, and the behaviors can come second. Now, I still think, and again, from conversations that we've already had, those swift decisions based on a current need tend to always work out poorly longer term, because you haven't put the thought and the process and the strategy behind what is this role needed for the longer term, and what is this person going to be doing, and the value they're going to be adding to the organization longer term. And so actually there are so many other ways of working where if you need a short term fix, then bring somebody in who's willing to do a short term piece of work. There's excellent consultants, excellent freelancers out there that don't want to be in a full-time role, and so bringing somebody in like that can go, right, this is the plan, this is your target for the next 3, 6, 9 months, whatever it is, and during that time we are going to bring somebody in that fits our culture, our values, and our behavioural model a lot better, and they might learn from you a bit more, because you can then teach those skills considerably better, and they're then just going to they're going to progress through the organisation because they've got the other elements are right. So my personal opinion is, I think the technical skill side of things is far too emphasised, as is as you kind of alluded to earlier, as is the experience within the sports industry. Those are the two things, ultimately, the sports nuance and inverted commas and the technical expertise, that can be learned better than anything. Obviously, that goes up to a certain point, but you still have that ability to transition. And ultimately, if you've got the aptitude to learn, which a lot of the stuff that you're doing at Greenhouse, as an example, working in a different industry, whatever it is, you can quite clearly show you've got the aptitude to learn. And so actually, that's not a difficult thing to transfer into our industry.
Yeah. And I think that's, everyone can do this given some time a little bit better if you just think around how you then construct your process and what are the skills you want. And I've seen some really good examples of kind of understanding what does the role need, and then creating situations that show that, which would be brilliant.
Yeah, agreed. Look, Don, we're at 25 minutes already. It feels like we only started this conversation 5 minutes ago, and it's absolutely flown by, which has been great. It's been really interesting. But before we go, time has now come to ask you the same 3 quickfire questions that we ask every guest that comes on the pod. So the first one: what is your most frustrating thing about recruitment?
Most frustrating thing about recruitment, I think, is speed to fill roles and not understanding what you really need or want.
Second question. Now, you don't have to name them, but you are also more than welcome to. Who has been your best hire and why?
Look, something I'm kind of really pleased with, I talked about earlier. Brought in someone brilliant, non-rugby, in my last role to run a kind of national system, and so the sort of lead of it was non-rugby, and they've done a brilliant job in absolutely maximising their space as an outsider, curious questions, no agenda, and done the best to this end in mind principle for the endpoint. So I think that was great and a good example of what happens when you look outside.
Yeah, and trust your instincts. And then final question from me today. What is the one thing you would change about the recruitment world?
It's a good question, isn't it? One thing I'd change, I think, just really like at its best, partnering people to help them understand and learn. And look, ultimately, great recruitment will teach you things along the way. So you will learn about yourself, you'll learn about the other people, and you'll learn about how to be better, even if it's not one way you've got external support. I think great externals provide like really specific expertise that you just don't get in your daily life. So that's the one thing I'd change, making sure people could really see it as a chance to value add to yourselves as well as everything else.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget that it can be a massive learning curve for everybody involved, and new people coming in are going to be different to you, going to have different interests, they're going to have different skills, and that's something you can learn from. Look, Don, thanks again. It's been brilliant. It's been a really good conversation. I think there's a huge amount that people can take out of this. So thanks for taking the time again, and thanks for coming on Talent Talks.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Cheers, Dan.